All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Manuel Lopez, and I think a lot of you already know me. I'm a professor of religion here at the college, and I want to welcome everyone here present, but I also want to welcome everyone present via, oh, we are not sharing, hold on. Yeah, everyone, there's people also present online via Zoom. So thank you, everyone. I would like to request the people via Zoom to please mute their mics. There is no like weird noises as the talk starts. So welcome everyone to our Global Wednesdays talk series. This is a series of lectures offered by some of our faculty, like is the case today, as well as guest speakers, and organized by the International Area Studies, the area concentration. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming my colleague, our colleague, since there's other faculty here, Professor Dr. David Harvey, Professor of History and International Studies. He's also currently our faculty chair. Dr. Harvey has a BA from Rice University and a master's and a PhD from Princeton University. His primary research interest is in the history of modern France and Germany. And he's also a very prolific researcher and writer. He's the author of 3 books. The first one, published in 2001, is the Constructing Class and Nationality in Alsace, 1830 to 1945. The second one, published in 2005, is Beyond Enlightenment, Occultism and Politics in Modern France. And as someone who studies religion, I was particularly interested in that one, which explores the Martinist movement, an esoteric tradition that emerged in France in the 1700s, with roots similar to Masonic rites all the way to the modern era. And the third one, the last book he published was in 2012, under the title The French Enlightenment and Its Others, the Mandarin, the Savage, and the Invention of the Human Sciences. Today, Dr. Harvey is here to talk to us about examining the relationship of the Enlightenment to slavery and colonialism in the talk titled Tropical Despotism, Slavery and Enlightenment Reform in the French Caribbean. So please help me welcome Dr. Harvey. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending. Actually, yes. Okay, so okay, can those of you online hear me okay? Okay, great. So anyway, what I'm going to be presenting today is related to a book project called Tropical Despotism, which is forthcoming, has actually been forthcoming for a long time. As Manu noted, I've been serving as chair of the faculty, and that does take up a fair amount of my time. But in any case, so this is going to be structured, I think, more or less as a traditional academic talk in history, though a little bit more informal and accessible to external audiences, I hope. If you have any questions about anything, I'll be happy to get into it in question and answer. Okay, so anyway, my interest in this topic really derives from a paradox. The 18th century is often known as the Age of Enlightenment, a period marked by, let me see, should this be? Okay, so period marked by a new secular spirit and critical approach in which thinkers such as Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau challenged political and religious authorities and shaped modern political theory, grounded in such concepts as human rights, popular sovereignty, and the separation of the powers of government. But the 18th century was also, yeah, that would be great. Yeah. But the 18th century was also the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, in which more than half of the roughly 10 million Africans taken as slaves to the New World made the Middle Passage. Great Britain and France, arguably the two most enlightened societies of their time, were among the most active participants in this trade. And many fortunes were made in slave trading and plantation agriculture in both countries. Now, this contradiction between Enlightenment idealism and the realities of Atlantic slavery was apparent to many observers at the time and has inspired a great deal of historical research ever since. And so that's sort of the question or the paradox that I'm drawn to. How is it that we have, in the Age of Enlightenment, this intensification of the slave trade, and what is the relationship between these two phenomena? Now, both of these enlightened societies, Britain and France, would ultimately abolish slavery. Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and banned slavery throughout its empire in 1833. The French case is a little bit more complicated just because of the complex nature of French history. Slavery was outlawed by the revolutionary government in 1794, reinstated by Napoleon in 1802, and definitively abolished following the Revolution of 1848. Now, enlightened humanism clearly played a role in both of these cases, although historians still debate its importance relative to other factors, such as changes in the global economy that made plantation agriculture less lucrative, and fears of slave revolt, the most dramatic instance of which, of course, is the Haitian Revolution starting in 1791. Okay, so then that brings me, so here we have sort of the global picture in terms of both the geographic distribution of the Atlantic slave trade, there on the left, and then here a chronological distribution where you can see this, the 18th century, and here really is the high point. It carries over into the early 19th century and drops off fairly precipitously thereafter. Okay, now the area of particular interest to me is the French Caribbean. And here we're talking both about the France's largest and one of the most lucrative plantation colonies of the period, Saint-Domingue, the present-day Republic of Haiti, and then a series of smaller islands, the Lesser Antilles, the most important of which are Guadeloupe and Martinique. And so, just as you can see, and I'm not sure how clear the demographics or the graphics you can see here are. This shows the breakdown of the population. You can see that slaves constituted the great majority of the inhabitants of all of these islands, with the free population, both white and black, being very tiny. And then this shows their production of sugar, Saint-Domingue being by far the largest plantation economy in the French Empire, but Guadeloupe and Martinique being fairly significant as well. Okay, so anyway, Tropical Despotism, which is the working title of my book manuscript, is an allusion to Montesquieu's concept of Oriental despotism. And the way I'm using the term, it refers to the Enlightenment's critique of cruel and arbitrary authority as applied to the colonial Caribbean. I'm particularly interested in the period between the 7 Years' War and the French Revolution, so roughly about 1763 until 1789. And this does, to a certain extent, build from my previous research that Manu was mentioning in his introduction. So my previous book was focused on essentially cultural and intellectual history, looking at writings of Enlightenment authors about slavery, colonialism, and contacts with the other. So for this current project, I'm shifting a little bit, still keeping maybe 1 foot in the Enlightenment canon, defined a little bit more broadly, but really shifting also towards a political administrative history of the empire, rooted in primary source research in the French colonial archives. And my focus here is reformist administrators who are employed by the French colonial state. Now, one thing that's interesting and important to note is that these are not completely separate spheres. That is the sphere of the Enlightenment and the sphere of the colonial administration. Many of the military officers, colonial bureaucrats, and civil officials who served in the French Caribbean in the late 18th century are well versed in the enlightened discourses of their time. They frequented the same clubs and salons and Masonic lodges as did the philosophes, and a surprising number of them dabbled in literary composition themselves. On the other hand, for their part, some Enlightenment figures actively sought out contacts with colonial officials, in part as sources of information for the books in history and political theory that they were writing, such as the Abbé Renaud's Histoire des Deux Indes, or History of the Two Indies. And then some of them also invested parts of their patrimony in colonial commerce. So the French Enlightenment and the French colonial state are kind of closely intertwined with each other. Okay, now there's one further clarification before I jump into my research. The French Caribbean colonies that we're looking at here did become, as I've said, highly profitable economic engines producing tropical goods, above all sugar, also coffee, cotton, indigo, a variety of other plantation crops, and therefore of enormous economic importance to the French state. But institutionally, they fell under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of the Navy, which had bureaucratic authority over all of the overseas empire in the 18th century. And this meant that economic interests, important as they were, are often subordinated to geopolitical concerns. Colonial governors are inevitably aristocratic military officers, and in the period that I'm looking at, nearly all of them had served in the 7 Years' War, which, as many of you know, ended for France with a disastrous defeat, the loss of both Canada and Louisiana, the destruction of much of the French fleet, and the wartime occupation of the islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. The post-war period is characterized by an upswell of patriotism and a reform agenda that focused on revitalizing the empire in preparation for a war of revenge against the hated British. Debates over slavery on both sides of the Atlantic, therefore, they're marked by this patriotic agenda, so that anything that could be characterized as strengthening the empire is received favorably, while anything that might weaken it was suspect and unlikely to gain support. Now, this is important because in order to convince their audiences, reformers had to argue that abolishing or reforming slavery would strengthen France's, rather than weaken France's strategic and economic interests in the Caribbean. And as I'll be arguing today, that really limits the scope of the kind of critique that they are able and willing to make. So this then brings me to the colonial reformers that I'll be talking about today. One of them, I'm sure all of you have heard of, the Marquita Lafayette, who fought alongside George Washington in the War of American Independence, and would go on to play a major role in the first stages of the French Revolution. Some of you might also know the Marquis de Condorcet, a mathematician and philosopher who was a disciple of Voltaire, who was a prominent figure in the late Enlightenment in France, and interestingly is one of the first men to make the case for equal rights for women. You most likely don't know Pierson Dupont, an economic theorist and journalist, although his name might be a bit familiar. He immigrated to Delaware during the radical phase of the French Revolution, where his son founded the chemical company that bears the family name. And then you almost certainly do not know Daniel Escalier, a career bureaucrat in the naval ministry whose career took him from the ports and shipyards of metropolitan France to various postings in the colonial Caribbean. And he ultimately ended his career in the early 19th century as French consul to New York. But he's such an obscure figure that I was not able to find an image of him anywhere online. So he's sort of the mystery man here. These four men had many things in common. They were deeply influenced by the Enlightenment canon and were well-educated cosmopolitan figures who moved effortlessly between Europe and the Americas and between the Francophone and Anglophone worlds. All of them, except for Condorcet, traveled to the United States at some point, and Condorcet had close ties to the American representatives in France, such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Two of them, Lafayette and Condorcet, were members of the hereditary aristocracy, while the other two were well-connected commoners with noble patrons. Now, of these four, only L'Escalier was actually a salaried employee of the colonial state, but all of them, to one degree or another, had connections to the French colonial Caribbean. Most importantly for our purposes, all of them denounced slavery as a moral evil and a blight on France's enlightened civilization, and all of them proposed projects for the abolition of slavery in the colonies. Okay, so first I'll talk about our journalist and economic theorist, Pierson Dupont. While still a very young man in his 20s, Dupont emerged as the spokesman for a group of free market economic theorists known as the physiocrats, and served as the editor of their journal. You can see here the Éphéméride du Citoyen. A pragmatic reformer who once wrote a fan letter to Benjamin Franklin while he was a very young man, Dupont denounced slavery in a 1771 editorial in the Éphéméride du Citoyen, and specifically cited a claim that Franklin had made in an essay 20 years earlier that free labor was both more productive and more profitable than was enslaved labor. Dupont then went about trying to prove the truth of Franklin's statement through a series of speculative and somewhat questionable mathematical calculations, formulas that were meant to evaluate the productivity, as well as the various hidden costs of reliance on slave labor. And he reached the conclusion that he wanted, which was that free labor would be more efficient. And he therefore proposed ending the slave trade, transitioning the colonies from plantation agriculture to a system of small independent farmers producing food crops, and using marketing incentives to encourage Africans to cultivate sugar in their own lands for sale to European merchants. Writing, quote, that the Africans, quote, would undoubtedly prefer to sell us the juice of their canes than the blood of their brothers, end quote. Now, given the powerful vested interests supporting Caribbean slavery, Dupont's proposals had little chance of gaining success. And in fact, they're generally ignored at the time that he wrote them. But they did have an influence on his fellow enlightened thinkers who began to debate how a transition from slavery to free labor might be brought about. So Dupont's essay at the beginning of the 1770s begins to introduce the topic into the French intellectual mainstream. Now, a decade after that, the Marquis de Condorcet, writing anonymously, published a short book, Réflexions sur l'esclavage des nègres, or Reflection on Black Slavery, which was the most extensive and specific proposal for abolition that had yet appeared in France. This comes out in 1781. Now, Condorcet was unequivocal in his condemnation of slavery as both immoral and contrary to the laws of nature, and he denied that it could be justified by either by the prosperity that plantation agriculture brought to the French nation, nor by the allegedly primitive nature of Africans. However, Condorcet's abolitionist sentiment, inspired by an enlightened belief in the essential equality and perfectibility of mankind, was tempered by Eurocentric and pro-colonial biases that were typical of his time. Now, today, Condorcet is best known for the work you see there on the right. This is an unfinished, posthumously published work, the Esquisse d'un tableau des progrès de l'esprit humain, or sketch for a historic account of the progress of the human spirit. What is published is actually, well, it's more than 100 pages, so calling it an outline is a bit of a misnomer, but he intended this as sort of the précis of a much larger work that he hoped to achieve, and which in the event he didn't live to achieve. He wound up being condemned and died during the Revolutionary Terror. But basically, this was meant to be a sort of macro philosophical history of the world that described the progressive advance of humanity from savagery to civilization. Now, Condorcet believed that contemporary Europe was the most advanced civilization on Earth, though he actually put his own times as the 9th in 10 stages of world history, and he predicted that sort of a glorious age of peace and freedom for the 10th stage of the future. But contemporary Europe represented the most advanced civilization that had yet existed, while Africans were barbarians who had to be civilized according to the European model. And these Eurocentric attitudes shaped the way that Condorcet thinks and talks about slavery. He feared that the slaves without education and accustomed to brutal treatment on the plantation would, quote, be incapable of fulfilling the functions of free men, and therefore, again, quote, it would be necessary to subject them in the first times to a strict discipline regulated by the laws, end quote. So while Condorcet proposed the immediate suppression of the slave trade and the emancipation of children born to enslaved mothers, he argued that adult slaves should continue to work under their masters for wages while being educated for their future lives as free men. He advocated a series of legal reforms to guarantee their well-being and humane treatment, rationalizing this decision, quote, under such conditions, they would no longer truly be slaves, but simply domestics engaged for a fixed term, end quote. This gradualist approach would, and again, quote, give the colonists the time to change gradually their method of cultivation, to obtain the means to work their lands by whites or by free blacks, and allow the government to change the system of police and legislation for the colonies, end quote. Condorcet's vision of emancipation, therefore, was a very slow process stretched out over decades, which sought to maintain France's political and economic control over the colonies. And this is the important point, that he envisions a very slow, gradual process that will end in freedom and wage labor, but will not be disruptive and will secure and guarantee France's political and economic interests in the New World. A few years after Condorcet's treatise, the colonial official Daniel Escalier developed his own blueprint for the abolition of slavery. He's influenced both by Condorcet's project of gradual emancipation and also by Dupont's claim that free labor was more productive than enslaved labor. Now, Lescalier is, I think, a very interesting figure. He spends much of his career working in the colonial empire. Though since he's an employee of the Ministry of the Navy, he sort of goes back and forth between postings in the French metropole and in the colonies. And he's actually captured by the British twice during his passages back and forth across the Atlantic. But although he serves in the plantation colonies, he does not, like many of his colleagues, link himself to the planter community through either investment or intermarriage. And his views on slavery were remarkably progressive and really set him at odds with most of his colleagues working in the empire. Lescalier focused on the process of labor itself and suggested replacing the brutal physical discipline of slavery, the whip and the chain, with positive monetary incentives, performance bonuses, essentially, claiming that these market incentives would lead to greater productivity, quote, which would be absurd to expect from beasts of burden directed by the lash. Through the system of bonuses that he proposed, Lescalier believed that the slaves would acquire capitalist work discipline, would gradually transform themselves into wage laborers, and could save enough capital to purchase their freedom and become small independent farmers in their own right. As a result, he declared, these people who have been so mistreated would begin to see happiness within their reach and to love their masters, end quote. Lescalier published his market-based plan for emancipation in the first year of the revolution, claiming to have discovered the means, again, quote here, to reconcile morality and politics in the cultivation of the colonies, to ally utility and happiness in the torrid zone. Now, ironically, the French Revolution saved Lescalier's career, as his anti-slavery views had antagonized his superiors, alienated the colonists, and forced his removal as the chief financial officer of French Guiana. He would go on to a distinguished career as a bureaucrat and administrator under both the revolutionary and Napoleonic regimes. However, before all that happens, during the 1780s, the final years of the French monarchy, Lescalier found a powerful patron with both the interest and the financial means to put his plans for a phased transition from slavery to capitalism to the test. Enter the Marquita Lafayette, who, as an orphaned teenage aristocrat with an immense personal fortune, had found both a surrogate father figure in George Washington and a cause, the fight for liberty and democracy, to which he would dedicate what would be a very long and eventful life. During his service as an officer on Washington's staff during the War of American Independence, Lafayette had his first encounter with slavery in Virginia and the Carolinas, which apparently led to some lively debates between the idealistic young aristocrat and his slave-owning mentor. In a letter dated February 5th, 1783, communicating the news of the signing of the peace treaty in Paris, Lafayette proposed to Washington that they go in on essentially an experimental project of emancipation, writing, "Let us unite in purchasing a small estate in which we might try the experiment to free the Negroes and use them only as tenants. Such an example as yours might render it a general practice, and if we succeed in America, I will cheerfully devote a part of my time to render the method fashionable in the West Indies. If it be a wild scheme, I had rather be mad that way than to be thought wise on the other tack." Now, it's really interesting looking at the correspondence because Lafayette keeps bringing this up, even though Washington just kind of brushes him off or says, well, let's wait and talk about this some other time. It's clear that already during his time serving in North America, Lafayette had developed ideas very similar to those that Condorcet was writing at the same time. That is, of trying to bring about a gradual transition from slavery to wage labor. Now, upon his return to France, Lafayette moved in progressive political circles, meeting both Condorcet and Escalier, and helping to found France's first abolitionist society, the Société des Amis des Noirs, or Society of Friends of the Blacks. At this point, Lafayette was famous back in France for his role in the American War of Independence. He also had friends in high places, including the father of one of his close friends, the Maréchal de Castries, who was then serving as Minister of the Navy. And Castries apparently gave Lafayette the green light to try to put his ideas into action, at least on a very small scale. 3 years later, in 1786, Lafayette wrote again to Washington that he had purchased an estate in French Guiana, quote, "on which I will work to emancipate my slaves, a project that is, as you know, my favorite hobby horse." Now, in fact, Lafayette purchased 3 small properties near Cayenne, the capital of French Guiana. There was Saint-Léger, a plantation of a popular red dye called Roku, Maripa, which was a livestock ranch, and La Gabrielle, which was a spice garden consisting of clove and nutmeg trees. Now, interestingly, Daniel Escalier was at this point serving as ordonnateur, or chief financial officer of French Guiana, and he advised Lafayette on his acquisitions and facilitated their purchase. Now, these actions will actually get Escalier in trouble with his superiors, who accuse him of doing what we might today call insider trading, basically using his role as an agent of the state to advance the interests of a powerful patron back in France. And there does develop, there's a clear class difference, obviously, between the aristocrat Lafayette and the career civil servant L'Escalier. And Lafayette emerges as a sort of patron, giving L'Escalier directions and asking his help in putting this experiment getting this experiment up and running. Now, Lafayette never actually goes to French Guiana, so throughout this period, he's functioning as an absentee landlord. And therefore, he relies heavily on L'Escalier's advice and assistance in getting the project started. L'Escalier, who had received little support from the ministry for his own abolitionist plans, was pleased to have found a powerful patron with the resources to act upon his ideas. He later wrote to Madame Lafayette that the spice garden at La Gabrielle in particular provided, quote, "the means to facilitate your good and useful project, because 10 clove trees and a bit of land surrounding them planted in food crops could make the fortune of a family who could cultivate it without the rod of slavery," end quote. Lafayette also sought the help of his fellow enlightened aristocrat, the Marquis de Condorcet, who recommended an idealistic young engineer, Henri de Richepre, to serve as a state manager. So Richepre arrived in Guyana in September 1786 and immediately assembled the slaves under his direction and ceremonially burned the whips and instruments of torture held on the plantation, telling them that their new master Lafayette had the goal of preparing them for freedom. Now, here's where we have sort of the interesting silences in the historical record. One can only imagine what the slaves might have thought, this confusion that this well-meaning declaration might have produced. In a letter to Lafayette the following January, Richepouet compared the slaves favorably to French peasants, declaring, quote, "They often surprise me by their gratitude and by the zeal and intelligence with which they work." Unfortunately, Richepouet died the following month of yellow fever, forcing Escalier to step in temporarily as Lafayette's agent in Guyana until a new manager, Jeannette, could be dispatched to the colony. Jeannette embraced this role from the outset, writing to Lafayette soon after his arrival in the colony in 1789, quote, "It will be glorious for me to have contributed to the good of humanity as much as my feeble talents will allow. Monsieur le Marquis is the first cavalier who has taken on such a deed, and I will surely be his faithful squire who will never abandon such a just cause," end quote. Now, the events of 1789 changed the course of this experiment in emancipation, as anyone familiar with the timetable of French history might well guess. Now, early in the year, Escalier is removed from his post after he departed for France without authorization to defend himself against his critics, depriving Lafayette of a key local collaborator. Several months later, of course, the French Revolution began, and Lafayette is swept up into national politics as the commander of the newly formed National Guard. Madame de Lafayette, Adrienne de Noailles, then takes primary responsibility for the project and corresponds regularly with Jeannette over the following 3 years regarding its successes and failures. So in practice, she really winds up being one of the key players in this experiment, and she's a very interesting character in her own right, though very young at the time that she's working on this project. Now, Jeannette remained devoted to the Lafayettes and their estate until the end, but he became increasingly disillusioned with their idealism and the difficulties of his assigned task. He reported that Escalier had made many enemies in the colony, and that the unfortunate celebrity that he had brought to their venture has done more harm than I can say. He also faulted Escalier's lack of knowledge of the practical details of plantation management, and frequently found himself in the awkward position of asking his patrons for more money to cover expenses. Jeannette found enlightened social engineering more difficult than his predecessor or his patrons had anticipated, and his initial idealism faded through contact with colonial prejudices and the challenges of his assigned task. Quote, "Presents, kindnesses, rewards for good actions produce no effect and do not earn any gratitude," he wrote to Madame de Lafayette in October 1789. "It is only through an exact and sustained discipline that one can obtain a moderate level of work from them and the maintenance of order." In March 1791, he reported that the noble experiment was beginning to show modest signs of success. Again, this is quoting from the correspondence. "They all now have a plot of land and a solid and sanitary cottage," he reported. "I ensure that they do not lack for food. Their illnesses are well tended. I never demand of them labors beyond their strength." Not everything had gone according to plan, as Jeannette acknowledged. "It has not yet been possible for me to abolish punishments, and I do not dare assure you that I will ever be able to do so, but I think we have greatly improved by making them as rare as possible." In a letter written the following June, however, Jeannette reflected that while he had been able to secure outward obedience, he had not been able to transform his relations with the enslaved laborers to the degree that he had hoped. Quote, "I can change neither their character nor their customs. I have only been able to establish discipline. Once their work is completed, their prayers and instruction done, they are free until the sound of the clock that calls them to duty. It would be cruel to bother them in their leisure while they rest from the fatigues of the day and forget their servitude." He further noted the gulf of cultural incomprehension and mistrust that stood between him and his labor force, writing, "I have only entered their cottages to say good day to them, to give presents to the children, and to check on the elderly, but I do so only rarely, for they believe that I have come to spy on them and are very distrustful," end quote. Now, the radicalization of the French Revolution, I'll go back to this slide for a minute, shaped the public debate over Lafayette's experiment in several key ways. It enfranchised and empowered poor white colonists in Guyana, many of whom were resentful of absentee landlords in general, and suspicious in particular of Lafayette. At first, Lafayette's abolitionist connections led the colonists to distrust him as a liberal do-gooder whose philanthropic plans threatened to disrupt the colonial racial hierarchy. When the monarchy was overthrown on August 10th, 1792, However, Lafayette moved from hero to villain of the revolution. As commander of the French army on the northeastern frontier, he ordered his troops to rescue the royal family. And when they refused to obey, he deserted across enemy lines to surrender to the Austrians. These acts led him to be branded as a traitor and an émigré, placing not just his holdings in Guyana, but his entire patrimony at risk of confiscation. With her husband outside of France, Madame Lafayette sought to hold things together. She wrote to Genet on November 28, 1792, that she had asked the minister that he be kept on as manager of their estates, fearing that otherwise these properties might be, quote, handed over to the negligence and depredations of the lower orders of the colony. She expressed particular concern about 71 slaves that nothing could ever engage me to sell, and asked Genet to do all he could to prevent their seizure by revolutionary authorities. Now, while Madame de Lafayette sought to retain as much of the family patrimony as possible, the revolutionary authorities in French Guiana swung into action. The properties of, quote, the traitor Lafayette, which had been placed under temporary sequester in 1793, were seized and put up for sale in March 1794, when they were purchased on installments by local sans-culottes, or members of the urban underclass. The revolutionary government of French Guiana proposed that Lafayette's slaves be acquired by the state to bring in the harvest on the national properties, other estates that had been acquired by confiscation from their aristocratic owners. Ironically, the sale of Lafayette's slaves from one branch of the revolutionary government to another took place just a month after the convention had abolished slavery throughout the empire in February 1794. It's just a sign of the difficulties of transatlantic communication in the 18th century. News took several months to arrive from France to the Caribbean. In a refutation of the legality of the seizure and sale of his possessions, written years later, Lafayette observed that this fact alone made the sale null and void. When the political winds had changed and Lafayette was able to return to France, he petitioned the ministry to, yes.
You can give
Okay.
the problem with the sharing.
Okay, I'm almost done. When the political winds had changed and Lafayette was able to return to France, he petitioned the ministry to recover his lost property, citing his humanitarian attempt for, quote, the gradual emancipation of the blacks. The ministry, concerned that this could set a precedent affecting other properties seized during the revolution, instead decreed that Lafayette be compensated with 140,000 livres, the price that he had paid to acquire the properties 15 years earlier. Lafayette's experiment in emancipation thus came to a belated conclusion. By this point, the slaves whom he had hoped to turn into free laborers and free citizens had been lost amid the masses of people of color in the French Caribbean who had been freed by the convention in 1794 and then re-enslaved by order of Napoleon in 1802. Whatever their merits as a humanitarian enterprise, as a money-making endeavor, Lafayette's estates in Guyana were a costly failure. Genet's account books for the period from 1789 to 1793 show an operating deficit of over 40,000 livres, a substantial loss even for a man as rich as the Marquita Lafayette. Now, wrapping up this discussion, I believe that the encounters between slavery and the Enlightenment that I've just discussed tell us a great deal about both slavery and the Enlightenment. The various efforts to reform slavery during this period failed because slavery is an inherently evil and oppressive institution that really couldn't be reformed or couldn't be mitigated without changing its entire character. They also failed because slavery is a very lucrative economic system, which generated an enormous amount of wealth and created a powerful interest block, including both the colonial planters themselves, the metropolitan merchants who traded in colonial commodities, and the investors whose fortunes were invested in whole or in part in the plantation economy. The abolition of slavery would require violent conflict in some cases, such as the Haitian Revolution and the American Civil War, while in other cases it would be brought about by a long process of peaceful gradual evolution, such as within the British Empire, where the political and economic clout of Caribbean landowners declined with the coming of the industrial age. So, but what do these examples tell us about the Enlightenment? The philanthropic idealism of Dupont, Condorcet, Escalier, and Lafayette was very real, and in my view, admirable. And it did, at least in the grand scheme of things, contribute to the rise of abolitionist sentiment and the decline and fall of slavery in the Atlantic world. At the same time, however, the prejudices and assumptions of enlightened opinion limited the scope of their critique in significant ways. As apostles of progress and the advance of civilized manners, all of these men shared the belief that European, especially French civilization, was the standard against which all other peoples were to be measured. They consequently viewed African slaves as barbarians who had to be civilized before they could be set free. Although to their credit, they explicitly rejected the racial essentialism that was becoming increasingly common in European thought in the late 18th century. As French patriots, they rejected any changes that would undermine French power or wealth in the Caribbean, and repeatedly insisted that their gradualist proposals would improve the lot of the slaves without harming the interests of the masters. Their proposals, I would argue, reflect what many of its critics have identified as the central flaws of the Enlightenment: a naive faith in reason and abstract principles, and in the malleability of human society to grand schemes of social engineering. I'll wrap up by noting that in sort of thinking about these cases and what they meant, I'm reminded of a famous phrase of Martin Luther King in the letter from Birmingham jail regarding the white moderate, who, quote, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. So that is, in a sense, the flaw of moderation and of the Enlightenment in its confrontation with slavery and colonialism. But at the same time, I do think it's important to be mindful that the words and actions of these moderates were seen as dangerously radical by many of their contemporaries, and that they did help to chart the course towards a more just and humane future of which we are the beneficiaries. And with that, I will end my remarks and open it up to questions.
Let me just go. There was a prompt at the end with the slide.
Okay.
Everyone could see.
Good. Did the transmission say
Yes,
active?
everyone
Okay.
can see, but I'm having problems getting back to Zoom from this computer.
Okay. Or do you have it on your
Yeah, I
on the
have
laptop?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll just leave this
All right.
on.
Well, maybe you can just
Yeah.
monitor, and if
Yeah.
anyone in the live stream has a question, we can take it. Does anybody in the room have any questions? Yeah, John.
When you were talking about their experiment,
Mhm.
and moving away from slavery to sort of, this capitalism. I'm curious, is there anything that described how, like, the culture of the slaves' lives changed? Like, for instance, like, were they paid like an adequate wage? Were they allowed to leave if they chose to? Were they, what sort of freedom or rights did they develop?
That is a very good question. And well, first of all, most of these are just blueprints. Lafayette's is the only case I know of, at least, where this was actually attempted to be put into practice. And it involved about a little over 70 people on a small property in what was very much a backwater of the empire. And one of the few scholarly articles I've been able to find on Lafayette's experiment argued that he chose Guyana rather than Saint-Domingue or Guadeloupe because, well, one, there was cheap land to be found there. A lot of it was wilderness. And two, there wasn't the same sort of large established planter community present, which obviously would have been very strongly opposed to these things. But I think you've identified one of the other real shortcomings in the way that these enlightened reformers thought about the transition. Notably, that they're not willing to challenge, even as they condemn slavery, they're not willing to challenge the property rights of slave owners. So in Escalier's formulation, there is the assumption that slaves, through working, would be able to save money and purchase their freedom from their former masters. Now, this was already happening on an individual level throughout the French Caribbean. Manumission by self-purchase was actually a fairly common safety valve within the empire and was sort of legally recognized. Now, doing it in a more systematic way rather than sort of on an ad hoc individual basis was a significant departure, but it says something that they still think that the property rights of slave owners trump the natural liberty of all men. So that's that is a significant shortcoming. Now, there are some interesting studies, and this really goes beyond what I'm looking at in this particular case study. And my project really ends with the coming of the revolution, just because the revolution changes everything, and that would be an entirely a whole nother project to look at. But there have been interesting studies both in the French Caribbean and also in revolutionary and immediate post-revolutionary Haiti about what happens, after slavery, because usually what happens is some sort of sharecropping relationship, not unlike that in the post-Civil War American South, and in some cases, notably in Haiti under Dessalines and Henri Christophe later on, are essentially forced labor schemes, to try to keep former slaves working productively to produce things for the market. So this question of how that transition is actually going to work, is a really fraught one. That's a really interesting thing to bring up. Yeah,
there's a question online. So
Oh, okay, thank you. Hi, here online. I'm Fidel Tavares. I'm an assistant professor at Queens College in New York City. When I saw the title of your talk, Tropical Despotism, I expected to hear a little bit more about the rationale for slavery in the 18th century and vis-a-vis then the critiques of slavery that arise. So I was just wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about those rationales for slavery, those contemporary rationales, vis-a-vis the ones that you talked about that critique slavery. And then the second part of the question is, are you in conversation with Pernille Rood's book on the economies and the reinvention of empire?
Yes.
Which basically, it treats the same topic here. So I was just wondering.
Right. And Dupont is okay.
I will catch you. Yeah.
All right. So where? Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Okay. So yes, I'll start with the second part of your question, because that's maybe more narrowly defined. Yes, I'm actually looking at some of the same figures that Pernille Rood talks about in her book. I mean, she focuses a lot on the physiocrats, so Dupont and his colleagues, and so that's one major area of overlap that I have. Now, as far as justifications for slavery in the period, there are a couple. One of the big arguments is a sort of climate determinism, an argument that only Africans who were native to the tropics could survive hard physical labor in the colonial Caribbean. And French Guiana plays an interesting role in that debate, because immediately after the 7 Years' War, there's an effort under the Duc de Choiseul to create a large new colony of white settlement there, to be sort of to compensate for the loss of Canada, and to serve as sort of a reserve for a colonial militia that would fight in future wars. But what happens is they recruit all of these European colonists to go to Guyana, and thousands of them die, mostly from yellow fever, malaria, and other diseases like that. And so defenders of, and this was explicitly intended to be a colony of free white settlement rather than a slave colony. And so defenders of slavery, notably the colonial official Pierre Victor Malouet, who's someone that I talk about a lot in my larger book project, takes the failure of the Kourou colony, as this colony of Guyana was called, as proof that slavery was essential to colonies in the New World. And even supposedly more anti-colonial, anti-slavery works like the Abbé Plenel's Histoire des deux Indes sort of articulates this climate-based argument, presenting slavery as a necessary evil given the conditions in the tropics. So that's one, the climate determinist case. Then there's another, and this, I think it originally derives from John Locke, but it's sort of reworked through a variety of 18th century thinkers, that slaves were essentially captives taken in war, and the alternative for them being sold as slaves would they would have been killed, and so therefore, slavery is seen as just sort of the natural outgrowth of war in internal wars that are internal to Africa, such that Europeans are just sort of the external beneficiaries of this process of African warfare, rather than actively encouraging it through their role in the transatlantic slave trade. And so this is an argument that Malouet makes in his writings, and that Condorcet in the Réflexions sur l'esclavage des nègres that I talked about explicitly argues against. So those are a couple of the main arguments. And then there's just sort of an economic utilitarian argument that the colonies are economically beneficial to France. They produce a favorable balance of trade, and therefore slavery is a necessary evil, but we can't undo it without causing the collapse of our economy. So those are some of the main arguments that are articulated in the period. Sorry, that's a really big question, and that's my effort to address it. But thank you for attending the talk. I was not expecting it. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jing.
Question.
Oh, there are no
ideas.
Yes.
You mentioned the few thinkers and writers,
Mm-hmm.
and some of them were very well known. And
Right.
the last figure, Escalier,
Yes.
seems to be very obscure.
Yes.
So how did he circulate his ideas? He wrote that book, and was the book forgotten and then noticed by later scholars? So how
Yeah. So
Do
he's.
you mind rephrasing, because other people?
Okay, sure. All right. So the question was about the circulation of ideas in 18th century France, and notably the role that some of the people that I'm looking at were very prominent, others less so. So L'Escalier publishes, well, first of all, interestingly, he apparently circulates a manuscript version of this. Oh dear, I'm sorry. Robocalls, so I'll just turn that off. Okay. While he's serving as ordinateur in Guyana, he actually sends in one of his letters to the Maréchal de Castries, the Minister of the Navy and father of Lafayette's friend. The letter refers to my secret plan to end slavery, which I revealed, which is for your eyes only. And in the letter, it's not accompanied by the secret plan. So I'm like, so that was actually the first thing I saw, and I'm like, okay, I'm curious about that. But apparently, and by context, I'm assuming that this was maybe a slightly less developed version of the book he later publishes, that he publishes during the beginning of the first year of the revolution. I'm not sure. I could find out, but I'm not entirely sure what circulation it had. I don't think he was quite as obscure in his own time as he is now. He was, as I mentioned, a colonial official who sort of rose through the ranks. He was never a governor or I don't know, an ambassador, a minister, or anything like that. But I mentioned he started out as sort of a low-level clerk. He then rose up to being a chief financial officer, albeit of a sort of backwater colony. He'd been a manager of, I think, the naval base at Toulon in the Mediterranean at one point, and then he winds up, actually under Napoleon, I think he serves several posts. He's in Genoa, I think, at one point as a French agent there, and then he winds up as consul in New York. So he had this interesting career, but he's sort of a middle management type. He's not that prominent. But as far as how these ideas get circulated, well, clearly he pitched his idea to Lafayette, and Lafayette liked it. these men were coming together in a variety of different associations. The Société des Amis des Noirs is one of them that I mentioned. Many of them are also members of Masonic lodges. Sometimes they would come together in Enlightenment salons, which were sort of essentially dinner parties hosted by wealthy aristocrats that were sort of tools for networking between intellectuals, officials, and so forth. So there are a lot of ways that ideas would have circulated at the time. And very often, so his book is published in 1789. I strongly suspect some version of it was circulating in manuscript form before that, though I don't have direct evidence of that. Malouet, who's another of the figures I didn't mention in this talk, but I mentioned in relation to the previous question, he's another career colonial official and someone who was Condorcet's antagonist in sort of a war of pamphlets over the merits of slavery. He was arguing the pro-slavery position, though he's also a reformer in his own way. Could get into that, but that's a whole other subject. But he writes up a book that's at once a defense of slavery, but at the same time calling for reforms to make it more humane, notably sort of a system of government inspectors to essentially kind of like OSHA for plantations, I guess, to have sort of government inspectors go into plantations to check on the welfare of slaves and to set rules on how they could be treated. So he is a reformer in a way, even though he is a pro-slavery writer. But he writes this pamphlet in the 1770s in response to a rumor. This is right after Louis XVI became king, after his grandfather died. And there's a rumor that the new king is thinking about abolishing slavery. It seems to have been just that, a rumor. But he writes up this essay in defense of slavery in response to that, sends it to the ministry. Turns out it's a false alarm, so it never appears. But then an expanded version of it gets published a decade later, after Condorcet has published his book against slavery. So he decides, he'd written it a decade earlier, and it had circulated in manuscript form, but he finally decides to publish it to respond publicly to the abolitionists. So anyway, that's ideas are circulating in print, but they're also circulating through manuscripts that are passed around by hand and by word of mouth in these various social spaces where enlightened elites gather. And one thing that's really struck me is the 18th century French Enlightenment is such a small world. All of these people knew each other. They were moving in the same circles. Yeah.
We have an online question. So,
yeah.
Elisa, do you want to ask Elisa Gage?
Yeah. Hi there. I'm an adjunct lecturer at both University of Florida and Stanford University. And my question, I know this is outside of your time period, but you were talking about Lescalier's career. Mm-hmm. And have you looked at his time? He's colonial prefect in Guadeloupe during the reestablishment of slavery.
Right. That is actually a really interesting question. I wasn't able to get into it in this particular project. And I actually looked a little bit at some of the records from some of the archival records from Guadeloupe during those years. I found a number of letters that he was writing to other members of the state, but I really couldn't find much of anything that expressed his own personal views. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's not surprising, you know, that the winds had changed pretty dramatically at this point. Napoleon had decided to reestablish slavery. He'd sent a major army under his brother-in-law to Saint-Domingue to try to reconquer the colony. And Lescalier was part of the group that was sent to Guadeloupe to reestablish, essentially reestablish centralized control, which included the restoration of slavery. Laurent Dubois, talks about this in The Colony of Citizens. So I really would like to know more about what Lescalier thought about his role there, but I have not been able to find that.
Thank you.
Thanks. No, that's a great question.
Maybe any other question, Manisha?
Yeah, Manisha.
Talk a little more about the historiography of studies of
Mhm.
French history. I know that there's been some certain resistance for a certain quite a long period
Yeah.
of time in the historiography of the British Empire.
Mhm.
More advanced, but often again educated by American scholars.
Yeah.
And I think in France too, there have been a lot of significant contributions by American scholars who work on France. So I'm wondering if you noticed that change over time. I think this is a very central period, and it's interesting that there hasn't been more
Yeah.
done about it.
Right.
About a quite central question.
Yeah.
Slavery.
Well, in fairness, there has. Okay, yes. So the question was about the historiography of slavery and colonialism in the French case. And yeah, in fairness, there has been a fair amount written over, I think I'd say maybe the last 20 or 30 years. But down until, I think probably when, the bicentennial era, starting in 1989 and then carrying through the various other bicentennials of other important events, such as the 1794 abolition of slavery, drew some more attention to this. But it's telling that even in the 1990s, when I was in graduate school, French history was taught, really almost without reference to the empire, slavery, the slave trade. You sort of knew that existed, but it wasn't really part of the narrative. And certainly it didn't give a sense of the importance economically or demographically that it had within the empire. So there's been a fair amount of writing about this within, I'd say since about 2000. Laurent Dubois, who's at Duke, is one of the scholars who's written the most about this. And so I guess what I'm engaging in a debate that has emerged really within the last couple of decades, I think, about that sort of questions this past of slavery and colonialism. There's also, I think, the fact that in contemporary French consciousness, at least, the old empire, that is the empire of the New World, has sort of been eclipsed by the newer empire, the sort of 19th and early 20th century colonialism in Asia and Africa, which is much more present in most people's consciousness. But this does become a touchy point. There was, in the 1990s, I forget exactly when, a lot of public controversy when the administration of the conservative president Jacques Chirac published an instruction that French schools should teach the positive legacy of French colonialism. And so that you can imagine a lot of professional historians were up in arms about that. But I do think, compared to the historiography in the British Empire, it's a newer phenomenon in the French case, but there is a fair amount of scholarship about it now, particularly with regard to Saint-Domingue. So I guess where I am right now, and what I'm kind of trying to do as I revise my book manuscript, is to situate my arguments in relation to what others have written. It's no longer an unexplored topic, although certain aspects of it, like Lafayette's plantation experiment in Guyana, are relatively unexplored. But what I'm really trying to do is to see how the sphere of colonialism and slavery and that of the Enlightenment are interconnected, because for the most part, these have been two relatively separate historiographies. And there is, as many of you know, in recent years, a sort of postmodern, post-structuralist critique of the Enlightenment that condemns its complicity in racism and Eurocentrism and so forth, but usually does so on a very abstract level. This is usually more like a deconstruction of Kant than it is a sort of hands-on engagement with archival materials. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to bridge the divides between those different bodies of scholarship. Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, David.
And thank you to the scholars that were from elsewhere that are signing on online. I was not expecting that. That's very nice.
Yeah, I'm actually just saying goodbye.
Mhm. All right.